All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Danica. I am with 3C Run in the County of San Luis Obispo, and welcome to our Energy Code Implementation Series with 2025 code updates featuring single-family additions and alterations with instructors Jennifer Rennick and Grant Murphy from Inbalance Green Consulting. Before I pass things off to Jennifer, I just have a few logistical slides to go over. A few quick Zoom reminders before we get started. Please make sure you are on mute for the duration of the training. We highly encourage questions, and if any questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. We have Grant Murphy here who will be keeping an eye out on the chat box. And this session is being recorded, and which will be shared with you along with the slides in the next few days. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about who we are. We are the Tri-County Regional Energy Network, also known as 3C Run. We are a collaborative partnership between San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. 3C Run is funded by ratepayer dollars collected through the public goods charge found on our utility bills. And the benefit of being ratepayer funded is that there's no cost to those we serve, and we are able to bring those dollars back into our region. Next slide, please. 3C Run currently offers 6 programs focused around 3 services: incentives, training, and technical assistance. Our training today is part of the Energy Code Connect program, and you can find additional trainings and learn more about our other services by visiting our website, 3c-ren.org. And with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer to get our course started.
Hey, Danica. Today, this is the third in a 5-part series that we're doing on energy code implementation while highlighting the new code updates for 2026. There's learning objectives and learning units. If you're architect and need AIA units, you can contact Danica and receive 1.5 units for that. And if I need ICC units, we've got units for that as well. Before I dive into the agenda, I just wanted to say welcome and just let you know, Jennifer Rennick, licensed architect and certified energy analyst, and Grant Murphy is also certified energy analyst through KBEC and also code coach for 3C Ren. Grant's going to be chiming in to kind of supplement anything that I say or needs clarification. And also Grant is going to be monitoring the chat and can answer a lot of the questions through chat. And if it's a question that can go to the bigger group, he'll stop me and ask that question. And we might have a few minutes at the end for follow-up questions. So we're going to start with a highlight of some of the 2025 code changes, and then we're going to dive into the additions and alterations for single family. And I've divided this up into kind of general things to know about for additions, alterations, kind of in general, and then specifically some features about the envelope to go over domestic hot water and electrification or electric ready, but really that's only one specific situation that comes up in additions, alterations, and then kind of opportunities for credits under the performance method. Okay, big picture here is that the 2025 building code will go into effect January 1st, 2026. And you can get those documents on the energy.ca.gov website. And there's thousands of pages available now for people to delve into. But hopefully you won't have to read all of them, because you're taking our classes or call us as a code coach and we can help walk you through it. Big picture for 2025, it's kind of a continuation of what the goals were under the 2022 Energy Code, and that's to continue encouraging energy efficiency heat pumps for space heating and water heating, expand PV systems and battery storage standards. That's kind of in general. It's not really applicable to additions, alterations of single family, but everything else, it's fairly applicable. Improve the indoor air quality by strengthening ventilation standards. So that's just kind of had some improvements in the new code from the last code. And then to look at specific ways to save water and save energy by reducing the water use in homes and non-residential buildings. And so specifically for like the non-res occupancies, it would be new requirements for chillers and cooling towers. But all of those changes together are estimated to save our state $4.8 billion in energy cost savings. The code implementation is a multi-year process. Our building code gets updated every 3 years. So prior to the code coming into effect, we're working on, as I say, the state and all the stakeholders and general public can get involved in the process as well. We start mapping out what the next code changes are going to be. And just kind of case in point, we're already talking about the code for 2028, even though 2025 hasn't come into play yet. But this gives you kind of an idea of what that timeline looks like. And this is just straight from energy.ca.gov from the CEC's website. And January 1st, 2026, then this new code comes into play. So yes, thousands of pages of resources for the energy code, including the standards themselves and reference appendices, but then there's also two manuals for helping to kind of navigate the code, ask and answer questions within the code that are common, things that people come across in their engineering, architecture, plans examination practice. And then we've got two manuals dedicated to better understanding the performance method and what goes into the computer calculations. So all these manuals will then be updated and available. I believe they're supposed to be available beginning of July this year for us. The structure of the energy code, it's good just to kind of review it, get a big picture on this. There's the section of the code that's all occupancies, and specifically, subchapter 2, section 110 or 110. There's some new mandatory requirements in there that is applicable to all the occupancy types. So I just want to point that out now. We'll touch on it a little bit later when it comes to water heating. And then the rest of the code is divided into, 3 big buckets: the non-residential, single family residential, and multifamily. And then today we're going to hone in on specifically subchapter 9 for additions and alterations of the single family resident occupancy. If you're new to the code, there's table 100 at the beginning of this that kind of outlines all the different sections that are applicable to different occupancy types and their application. And so I just excerpt the portion that is spelled out for single family, and then highlighted in the red box, additions, alterations. And you might note that when you're in the code looking at it, everything for additions and alterations is going to be 150.2, either A or 150.2 B. So this table may be more useful for finding the mandatory measures and some of the prescriptive components, but for additions, alterations, basically could just go to that section, and then there, it's further divided. And I have a couple slides to help you figure out what that is. 3 terms to keep in mind: mandatory requirements are energy efficiency measures that are applicable to all projects. And like I said, that can be high level for all occupancy types, but then each, of those 3 buckets, single family, for example, has their own mandatory requirements that's just specific to the mandatory measures of single family. And then there's the prescriptive component package that you can use to show that your building is compliant with the energy code. And it's basically following a checklist or like following a recipe card. And then there's the performance method or the energy modeling or computer modeling approach. And this is where your project is compared to a baseline building that follows the prescriptive pathway, but it allows you to have trade-offs. So you can deviate from the prescriptive components. Now, currently, we're using for our non-res buildings and for additions, alterations, single family, we use TDV, time-dependent valuation, as the metric. That metric overall throughout the energy code for 2025 is being replaced. So now we have a new metric. Instead of time-dependent valuation, we're looking at long-term system cost, LSC. And it's the CEC's, or California Energy Commission's, projected present value of cost to the California's energy systems over a period of 30 years. So even though it's got the term cost in the name, it's based on present value. Note, it's not a representation or a prediction of individual energy bills, but it's the cost to the state, essentially. It's a cost to the energy infrastructure and everything that goes into supporting it. And then the source energy is defined now as the long-run marginal source energy of fossil fuels that are combusted as a result of either burning fossil fuel to create the electricity that goes to your building, or burning a fossil fuel like natural gas directly in the building. So this is just an example of what that will look like for the non-res, give you an idea about those. However, specific to additions and alterations under single family, we're only going to be looking at replacing that TDV with the long-term system cost efficiency of the building. So doesn't include PVs, does not include batteries, and does not include a source metric. For the new construction, including ADUs, which we'll get next time, then the EDR score is also replaced, but it includes all 3 of those components that we saw on the other slide: efficiency, total, and source. It's also important to keep in mind for your performance computer modeling method that you can take your project and model it as an addition alone. And that way of doing it tracks very closely with all the new construction standards. Not exactly, but very close. You can also take your remodel project and run it as an existing plus an alteration. And then a lot of times what we see is with home remodels, there's often some addition some alterations, and we need trade-offs. And the way to do it is we could take the existing building plus the alterations we make, plus the additional, square footage volume that's added, and combine it together and run that under the computer method. And it often allows for trade-offs to help with that addition complying with the energy code. And part of the reason for that is addition, for example, it's nuanced in the code. If you do an addition prescriptively, it depends on how big the addition is, which determines how much window or fenestration area you can have. And a lot of times the projects we're working on, for example, you might want to enlarge a living room just a little bit, but also include a lot more windows to take advantage of a view, for example. And so that small addition might exceed the budget on windows. But if you combine it with alteration and the existing home, we can often get that whole project to pass energy code and come up with something that's better for the homeowners. And in order to do that, that existing building may need to have a HERS verification of existing conditions as part of it, so we have a baseline to start with. And at the end of it, we'll touch on those kind of situations for the HERS. With the performance method, an example of that trade-off, what you might see a report from your Title 24 consultant is, there's going to be the energy use currently. It's going to be in TDV, KTDV, and you'll have an energy summary for your space heating, space cooling, indoor air, ventilation if included, but water heating. And those three components are the main ones: space heating, space cooling, and water heating. So if you're over budget or below standard, a negative number will show up on your compliance margin, and you'll have to have some improvement in order to make up for that below standard. And what we're seeing with a lot of the projects, one way to do that is to improve their water heating. And especially if they have a tank type water heater that needs replacement, we can include that as part of the alteration. You could get some credit, and then that puts you above the standard, and then the building complies. So that's one example of how we might be able to do it. And then, yes, that TDV is going to be replaced with LSC, savings costs, long-term savings costs, efficiency. Okay, I'm just going to call it LSCE from now on. So, okay, additions, alterations, now getting into that part of it specifically. So we kind of set the stage with all those things we can look at, but now there's certain mandatory measures that additions and alterations have to follow. There's prescriptive additions part of the code, that's that 150.2A, and then there's prescriptive alterations, which is the 150.2B set of requirements. And I am going to give you kind of a little bit of a highlight here on what's happening and where some of the changes are for the 2025 code. But kind of a, spoiler alert, there isn't a lot of changes in additions and alterations for the 2025 energy code. So yay, that makes it a lot easier for many of us. Almost all of the mandatory measures in section 150 are applicable to your additions and alterations, but not everything. So we're going to look at that in the next slide. And additions have some minor updates, and there is a new section though for heat pump space heating capacity and sizing. So that's new in the 2025 code. I'll show you that. And then the alterations has some very minor updates, but most notably it's around your windows and window replacements. There's some updated U factor and solar heat gain coefficient requirements. But for the most part, the 2025 code changes are related to just supporting heat pump space heating and electrification. So throughout the code for the additions, alterations, it refers back to the mandatory measures that are actually part of 150.0. But it's 150.2 that is dealing with which of the mandatory measures are going to be required for additions and alterations. And I just put the list here for you on the right-hand side of all the ones that would be applicable to additions and alterations. And it's notable to see that solar ready, PV, battery ready, electric ready for heat pumps, cooktop dryers, etc. Those are not required for additions and alterations. Just new construction. When you dig into the code right away, it starts out with a whole bunch of exceptions, which is good. They put those up front, but it can also be a little bit kind of confusing when you look at the code to look at the exceptions first. But it's important that you note the exceptions first, because if your project meets one of those exceptions, then it just saves you a whole bunch of time of worrying about that project needing to meet that particular requirement. So if you're doing addition, you'll want to look at the square footage of the addition, because that's going to actually determine which bucket of requirements you need to follow. And, additions of 300 square feet or less, for example, you don't have to worry about the SRI ratings for cool roofs, for example. And additions of 1,000 square feet or less for certain climate zones that require whole house fan cooling, whole house fan ventilation, that doesn't apply. So like climate zone 9 in Ventura, for example, additions 1,000 square feet or less, then you don't have to worry about that whole house ventilation cooling applying. And then it's just kind of important to remember that existing heating units, if they're remaining, not changed, you don't do anything to them, you don't have to worry about updating it to meet the energy code. But if you do expanded duct system from it, the expanded duct system has to comply. And then this is a really kind of nuanced change. I'm going to go over here on this third bullet point, but there's some things that are, keep in mind, like, if you have piping that's not accessible, you don't have to worry about going back and insulating it. When ducts are extended from an existing duct system, then there's certain applications. Yeah. Is there a question, Grant? Oh, I heard something. Okay.
There was a question, but I don't know what that noise was. Maybe someone accidentally unmuted.
Oh, okay. No problem. And then so this is this new part. We're going to touch on heating system capacity. Third bullet point, heating system capacity must be adequate to meet the minimum requirements of California Building Code section 3.1. Okay, I don't think the architects are going to care too much about this, but it's slightly, noteworthy for the folks who are maybe designing the system, that they've just clarified that this part now needs to comply with the California Residential Code, and they referenced a different section. It's R 303.10, and it's basically states that every dwelling unit shall be provided with heating facilities capable of maintaining certain room temperatures, 68 degrees, etc. But they've included that it also has to be true for 2 feet away from exterior walls. And I think the thing to note here for maybe the homeowner and the architect, the builder, is that that's the last sentence, the installation of one or more portable space heaters shall not be used to achieve compliance with this section. And I point that out because we get that question. I've gotten it a number of times as a code coach. Can I just bring in a space heater for this addition that I'm doing and not have to deal with my existing heating and cooling system? And basically the answer is no, that's not code allowable. For space heating, for the additions, the space heating system, under the current code, you can use a new or replace space heating system, and it can be a heat pump or it can be a gas heating. But that part goes away. The gas heating system goes away under the 2025 code update, and it's just heat pump only. So you do an addition, you add a heater for that addition, it's going to be a heat pump.
And just to emphasize, that's for prescriptive compliance. So if you're
That's
using
right.
the prescriptive pathway, you'll have to use a heat pump. If you're using a performance method, you'll still be able to use gas systems. In all likelihood, you'll just be penalized for it.
That's right. And that's where we get to those trade-offs. Exactly. That's right.
Right.
So, but this becomes your baseline.
Right.
And then part of that prescriptive pathway, and again, then it reflects on the baseline. So a lot of architects, this probably isn't very interesting, but if someone's doing your an engineer, or you've hired someone to do your sizing of your heat pump system, then there are some prescriptive tables for kind of maximum capacity or size that you're allowed to do. Now, this assumes ducted systems. I'm going to clarify here, but this is a new section specifically for looking at your heat pump load calcs and that system capacity. And there's also a prescriptive table for infiltration rates you're supposed to use when sizing your equipment. And then the exception to that is if you actually do field testing of envelope leakage. And that means like having a HERS rater, or now it's going to be called ECC rater, come out and do a blower door test. And this again becomes the baseline. You can do a performance method and go that route as well. And then additions, there is some exemption, some requirements for indoor air quality ventilation, which is different than that whole house cooling. But the cutoff for that also is additions of 1,000 square feet or less. You don't have to have indoor air quality, fresh outside air fans. And if you're creating a junior ADU or junior accessory dwelling unit, you also don't have to have comply with all of the outside air fans. But you still need local mechanical exhaust for your kitchens and bathrooms. And those would also have field testing. So that hasn't changed from 2022. And then just kind of reminder that outdoor air quality ventilation, outside air ventilation It still continues to follow ASHRAE 62.2 for the basis, and the language that had been updated for your ventilation duct sizing for your kitchen and balanced ventilation with heat recovery, etc. The language and all those requirements remain the same. However, if you choose to install balanced ventilation with heat recovery as an option, because that's what you want to do, and maybe you're improving the indoor air quality for the whole home or for those additions, there is a new section for mandatory measures for that balanced or supply only systems for HRV and ERV. And mostly what this has to do with these mandatory measures is making sure that you can access the energy recovery ventilation fan system, because they have filters, to sometimes pre-filters to keep large debris out of your more fine filter, MERV 13, because MERV 13 filters required for the supply air, and they do need cleaning. And you want to also be able to access the heat recovery or energy recovery cores, and some of them you can clean them, and some you have to replace. So there's requirements about where they go, how you can get to them, and then also specific requirements for the outdoor air intake, such as they be rain or waterproof, which a lot of times means covers to protect them. And they need to be located where a person can access them. So no more than 10 feet above a walking surface, for example. And if you do put it up on your roof, then there's additional requirements for how you can access these. So this, if you know you're going to do this section is important for the architects to take a look at, so they can make sure it's incorporated into their project properly. And this is a mandatory measure. And then part of those mandatory measures, the code hasn't changed on this. Enclosed kitchens, open kitchens have certain requirements for fresh outside air. And it continues to be the case where these systems can be turned on and off manually. And it is the switches are supposed to be labeled with something such as, this switch controls the indoor air quality ventilation for the home. Leave the switch in the on position at all times unless the outdoor air quality is very poor. So you're supposed to have control and have access to those switches, and technically they should be labeled. Kitchen range hood continues to have an option for your range hood having a what's called a CE, or capture efficiency rating. And if that unit hasn't been rated for a capture efficiency, then you can also use the required amount of CFM. And it's allowable for you to have natural gas range, your choice. If you do the capture efficiency or the CFM rating is going to be higher than it would be for over an electric range, which includes induction. And then this is based on the floor area of the dwelling units. So essentially, bigger homes, larger volume of air, any pollution is diluted more. Smaller homes, concentrated pollution, less volume, requires a high CFM of exhaust. And then the mechanical exhaust for the kitchens is to be field tested with the airflow hood. And you can follow the prescriptive method for setting up that duct system. such as the duct length is to be less than 25 feet and have no more than 3 elbows, and the exterior termination needs to have a proper fitting to protect it. Now, alterations that only replace the hood and does not alter or add or replace existing ductwork would be an exception to this. So you're doing a kitchen remodel and you're keeping everything in the same place, but you're getting a better hood, a nicer hood, a new hood. Then you've met that requirement. But if you tear up the whole place and have a new pathway and new ductwork, then you need to meet these requirements. So that kind of brings us into the alterations sort of section. And the prescriptive alterations are labeled A through N in this part of the code. And these sections have remained the same, so we are not seeing any change here. And then these prescriptive component alterations, in many cases, you follow it prescriptively, and there really isn't any need to run something in the performance method. But what we often will see is that if you're doing a whole house and your existing plus alteration, then some of these prescriptive alterations can be the baseline that you're compared against for that performance method. And then a kitchen remodel is a common residential alteration we see. So new appliances and vent hood, for example, you might also include at that point, this particular example, they also added new mini split system with concealed ducts, and they had new lighting, including surface and recessed ceiling. So even though the kitchen alteration was mostly focused to the kitchen and living room, it can hit on a lot of these other requirements. And in the end, for this particular project, we ended up doing existing plus alteration to have compliance for this whole house. This was a new section that was added in the 2022 code, and this section remains under the 2025 code, and it just comes back to the indoor air quality ventilation systems. And it basically, under alterations, it is a little more nuanced. It's going to talk about fan replacements, mentions air filters, specifically kitchen exhaust, bath exhaust, and exhaust fan replacement. So if you're doing those, you may need to go and dig in deeper to this part of the code. Some of the alterations for ducts, there were some updates from 2019 to the 2022 code. For example, ducts extended at least 25 feet triggered this part of the section. Previously it was 40 feet. So I've still run into folks who are say, oh, I thought it was 40 feet. Like that was 2019 code, but this code keeps the 25 feet trigger. And if you do have duct testage leakage that needs to be done, that's got to be all tested to 10%, and leakage to the outside of the house to test 7%. So what this means too is you're going to have a HERS rater come out there and do that duct leakage. And if your HVAC system is located in the garage, then for sure duct leakage testing is triggered. And then the duct insulation for per climate zone is still the same. They didn't change that. So it still is an R6 for climate zones 3 and 5 through 7. So that's most of our Tri-County region. And then for those of us who live up in North County, San Luis, or out in the kind of the north part of Ventura, then the R8 ducts would be triggered for climate zone 9 and 4. And then kind of just a clarification. This comes up here and there as we're doing this work for alterations, because the question is, can we just keep our electric resistant space heating system? And typically a ductless electric wall heater is not allowed, but there is some exceptions that you might meet these exceptions. And so you would be able to keep your electric resistant space heating system. For example, if the existing space heating system is already electric resistance and a ducted space cooling system is not being replaced or installed. So once you like add air conditioning, for example, then you should just move to a heat pump that can provide both cooling and heating. They're saying you can't just keep your electric resistance heating, but only install an air conditioner / heat pump that only provides the cooling. Like it needs to do both. It can do both. So that's kind of an example of that. But if you don't, yeah, go ahead.
No, keep going. I was going to pause you for a quick question.
Oh yeah, now's a good time.
Okay. We had 2 questions, well, 3, another one just came in, that are kind of related to HERS, and I think we get to some of the ECC HERS items a little later on. But Fabian was asking the exact definition of a kitchen remodel. So the previous slide or 2, you had that shown as like a scope of work.
Oh yeah.
My understanding is it's not like a definition, but he was wondering about on Cheers on the forums, there's an option to select kitchen remodel for single family alterations. I was wondering what that trigger is for that definition of sorts.
That is a good question. We're going to have to go into Cheers and play with that form to see what they're triggering for it. But I imagine that if you click kitchen remodel, they're going to ask you about the hood, for example. They're going to ask you, are you replacing the hood or are you and reusing the existing ductwork? Are you, because that could trigger that ventilation system.
So it might be more of a leading question than like a defined scope of work triggering specific things.
Right. That's right.
And
then,
just,
go ahead.
Just to clarify, is this something that is any of this new in 2025? If I remember right, this is in 2022 as is. So nothing's changed in that regard.
Right. So the other thing, like kitchen remodel, is a lot of kitchen remodels trigger new lighting. And sometimes they trigger ceiling alterations. And so we're going to get on that. We're going to get there in just a moment. But if it triggers lighting, then they're going to ask you questions about the lighting, because the lighting and the controls and all the lighting itself needs to comply with the Title 24.
Okay.
And then it just kind of goes from there.
Okay. I'll circle back to Zach's question when we get back to the ECC stuff. And then we just had one that was if a system is in a garage and duct leakage is triggered, is it still 6%? Is that something coming up?
It's 6% for the new, but you're really not going to want any duct leakage in the garage. So you're gonna yeah, I'll have to look that up, because usually the projects we're working on, really, they're like, you are trying to eliminate all duct leakage right at the unit. So the other visual inspection, there's the duct leakage testing, but the visual inspection of is what condition is the mastic in? Did they use mastic and tape? Are all the joints sealed? I've been to some projects where they had like punch outs in the ductwork and never came back and sealed those punch outs. So you see this little round sheet metal just hanging there with a hole right there. And so supply kind of is one thing, but you really got to make sure the return is not leaking at all in a garage if you're using your garage for anything that garages typically are used for. You don't want that in your air quality. So that should be all tested. Yeah.
Keep going. We'll catch more of these as we keep going.
Okay. So for the envelope, not a lot has changed here, except for update on the windows. If you are having a new residence and you have an addition, there's new walls. Those new walls trigger requirements that are like new construction. However, that wall extension, when the wall is in line with an existing wall, you do not have to prescriptively, remember prescriptive, you don't have to apply the continuous insulation that would typically be required for new wall construction. The new walls need it, but the wall extension doesn't need it. Now, architecturally, this is where we end up going back to that computer method, because performance method, because a lot of times folks, you know, if the old house has no exterior insulation on it at all, and they have a wall extension without an exterior insulation requirement, then those new walls, they want it to match and look like the rest of the house. So we would do trade-offs against that continuous insulation, for example. Same idea with your existing residence, and you do a garage, attached garage, and it's now, you convert it, and so it's counted as an addition. You have all existing walls there, and then the trigger for the exterior insulation is if you're removing and replacing the siding. If you keep all the siding intact, then you're only required to just fill the cavity if it's 2x4 framing with an R15, for example. This is what the CEC from their Blueprint magazine or Blueprint newsletter, they created this graphic, and I just added a couple more notes to it. And this just gives you a visual of what's considered to be a wall extension and then what is not a wall extension. And essentially, if those two walls are not in plane with each other, then it's not a wall extension. And if you're following the prescriptive way for additions, then you would prescriptively be required to have a exterior continuous insulation. I included this slide for your reference. It's an excerpt from the ACM manual. So one of those manuals that I mentioned out of the 6 at the beginning. There's thousands of pages. I just pulled this one for you so you would have it handy. And it just gives kind of a quick table of your sort of proposed design exterior wall assembly situation, what's required for an addition, and then what would be required in an alteration setting. Now, a lot of times, some of the requirements, like I said, for that addition isn't acceptable to the owner, the designer, in dealing with that different wall thickness in terms of how the windows look from the inside or the outside. And so then we get into a performance method, but this is what you would be compared against for your baseline. When we look at alterations, meaning we're not adding volume or floor area, but it's an interior, for example, this like the kitchen remodel, we'd have altered walls that are potentially altered walls that are part of the kitchen remodel. So if you're tearing off the interior drywall to add a new window and to get to the plumbing or the hood ventilation, etc., then those walls being altered, you only need to put back in R13 in a 2x4 framing, for example. But the windows themselves are going to have these different requirements based on your climate zone and whether you're just replacing windows up to 75 square feet or less, or if you're replacing more than 75 square feet, or if it's brand new additional window or skylight, so additional fenestration. So depending on the climate zone, that's going to determine your U factor for the window, and it's going to determine the solar heat gain coefficient. And it'll also determine if it's going to trigger how much overall glazing is a part of the floor area. There are some exceptions for that. I'll show you that on the next slide, but I wanted to give you kind of a general idea of what that looks like and kind of a table to reference. Now, I'm going to walk you through the next slide here on new construction. And the reason for that is in the alterations and additions, a lot of times you're going to end up just complying with the current energy code for new windows as if it were new construction, because it's sometimes the easiest way to do it. And so as a reminder, under our current code, we have a U factor of 0.3 for all our climate zones. And then just for climate zones 2, 4, and 6 through 15, we have a solar heat gain coefficient of 0.23. And then it's only the 3 super mild climates, or considered kind of mild climates, that don't have a need for keeping the sun out and wanting sun in through those windows. Then there's no solar heat gain coefficient requirement for climate zones 1, 3, which 3 is around San Jose, San Francisco Bay Area, and climate zone 5, which is San Luis Obispo area and Santa Maria area. No solar heat gain coefficient requirement. Okay, and then for those other hotter climate zones, we also have a 5% maximum west facing. Now, this is prescriptive, meaning this is also your baseline, what you're compared against. But the new code update is they said, okay, for certain climate zones, not all of them, but a bunch of them, we're going to decrease the U factor to 0.27. Okay, so that's true for climate zones 1 through 5, 11 through 14, and 16. And then the U factor of 0.3, it's no change for our climate zone 6 through 10 and 15. There is an exception in climate zone 5 for conditioned floor area less than 500 square feet. And there's an exception for up to 16 square feet of skylight that can have that 0.40 U factor. Okay, and then just for climate zone 15, they decreased the solar heat gain coefficient to a 0.20 now. And then the other climate zones don't have any change in their solar heat gain coefficient, and there is that exception for 16 square feet of skylight for certain climate zones. And that's, you know, we still have the 20% max and 5% maximum facing glazing for certain climate zones. So that that's kind of now our new comparison between the two. So usually when we're talking to like municipality or authority jurisdictions having authority and trying to help them understand what's required for window alterations and window replacements, we've provided them with these charts, which seem pretty straightforward because you just look at climate zone 2, 4, 6 through 15, one set of requirements, climate zone 1, 3, 5, 16, another set of requirements. There's some exceptions of whether you're adding, 16 square feet of skylight, has a different, U factor, 75 square feet of fenestration. You're not required to meet the total fenestration area and west-facing fenestration requirements. And so that now under 2025 is a little more nuanced and is changing. So basically that other table now gets broken up into different tables because it's nuanced by the climate zone. And we have some new requirements now for 1, 3, 5, and 16. So skylight replacement, lower U factor, window replacement, lower U factor. And then the exception is simplified. It's just 16 square feet of new fenestration or skylight. Okay, so now when we take a look at those other climate zones, I broke it into 2 separate tables to try and simplify it for you. So you would just have a copy of this. The way it's written in the code is it says, oh, you have to comply basically with the new construction except, and then there's all these exceptions. So I tried to hopefully spell this out for you and make it a little easier to reference this way. But the notable changes are that the climate zone 15 has an exception for the replacement where you only need 0.23 again, not the 0.2 on new construction. So that's okay. So that's good. The skylight replacements 0.4. So that also has been updated across all climate zones. And then for just some of the climate zones, we're having the window replacement greater than 75 square feet or just new additional fenestration with the lower U factor. So hopefully that will make it easier for you all to look it up and have as a reference. So when it comes to our additions, roof ceilings, this, the change from the 2019 code was that some climate zones 2, 4, 8, 9, 10 got upgraded to an R38 requirement. Otherwise, it was an R30. And this is for additions that are 700 square feet or less. And that's part of the prescriptive additions kind of package. You will want to know how many square feet you have and then sort of look up in the code based on that square footage. But this was one of the changes before. This is going to remain in effect. So no change there. And also something that was introduced in the code in 2022, and there's no change on this, is that certain climate zones were triggering an R49 in the attic. And then there was certain climate zones, recessed downlights in the ceiling shall be covered with insulation the same depth. And also for existing recessed lighting, they do need to have a fireproof cover put on them unless you're replacing those light fixtures. And at that point, you can have insulation covered, rated down recessed light fixtures. So good, that's going to remain the same. And then just as a reminder, that part of the code really references back to the electric code and is just spells out a little more clearly what the clearance is needed. And if you don't purchase an already made recessed light cover, you could create one out of drywall. Just need to make sure that the everything's sealed, the joints are sealed, and that you have a 3-inch clearance above that fixture to the bottom of your drywall cap. And with the alterations, when you're working with ceilings of vented attics, this was a new section. The section's going to remain, and it's remain unchanged. Basically, the gist of this was where you can go into the attic and air seal everything. And then there's a couple exceptions to the air sealing requirements. And that's, for example, if you've got already an R38 existing insulation, you don't have to go back in and tear that up to air seal. But also if there's asbestos or knob and tube wiring. So it's acknowledged that really old homes that have that, you can basically leave it as is. And then there's going to be situations where there's just not enough space in the attic to do it. But the idea is where you can, you want to improve the performance of the house overall. So for now, we're going to move on to some domestic hot water real quick. Additions, the way it was written or currently in the code, additions, where you're adding a second water heater, you could put in a gas or propane instantaneous water heater. You could put in a heat pump water heater. And for additions that are 500 square feet or less, you could put in an instantaneous electric water heater, as long as you did point of use distribution. So now they've kind of clarified in supporting heat pumps and moving away from fossil fuels. Again, this is a prescriptive requirement. So they don't call it a second water heater, but it's an additional water heater. And the gas or propane instantaneous isn't a baseline or prescriptive option. You would have to go to performance method. And then they've clarified that for your 500 square feet or less, it can just be an electric water heater. It doesn't have to be an instantaneous. So it could be a small tank type, but you still have to have the point of use distribution. And this, I just put this code language in here for you as a reference, just so you can see that for 2025, the gas unit was removed from those requirements. So that's just a reference. And what that point of use looks like under the 2025 code. It's also true for new dwellings that are 500 square feet or less. But you can install a tankless or a small tank type electric water heater. And what you'll want to do is have that either a tank type like a heat pump water heater, or a small tank electric water heater. You still want to have your most direct line of getting the plumbing from your water heater to the fixtures. And the point of use requirement is that for example, for sinks, you're typically only going to use a 3/8 inch PEX line. For your showers and your washer, only a 1/2 inch. And there's certain length of pipe per nominal size diameter that's required. And the way we've seen this be met the most with our HERS rater is when they take a direct line from the water heater to a manifold system, and there they can run a straight line to the different fixtures with the smaller diameter pipe. And you want to keep it as compact as possible to meet these requirements.
Jennifer, I just want to confirm that includes vertical distance. It's not just horizontal linear.
It's horizontal in plan view, but it does clarify that you're not supposed to take that. You have to take the most direct path. So you can't go from, for example, let's say in plan view, it looks like that water heater is, okay, I'll go back. It looks like this water heater is really close. The manifold is right there. There's enough distance so the person can put the, pull it all together. and then it goes straight to those fixtures. But let's say, for example, they took this, instead of going through the wall to the shower into the washing machine, they take the manifold, they go up, because they have 10-foot ceilings, and then they went over the ceiling and then back to the wall and dropped it behind the washer. You're not supposed to do that because that's not the most direct path. But then you would look at it in plan view, assuming you take the most direct path. So, for example, to get to that sink, though, the most direct path probably is to go up over the ceiling and back down, because you'd have a hard time with a door being there.
Sounds like a nice gray area that
Yes,
it should just be including vertical, but it's not saying that anywhere, huh?
right.
Nice.
Doesn't say it. Yeah. So, but it does say you can't go up and over and around and about. You got to take the most direct path. So, new for 2025, mandatory measures for heat pump water heaters. Okay, this has been moved. These mandatory measures are in section 110.3, service hot water, which is high level in that building tree of the energy code I showed you. You're not going to find it in the residential mandatory measures. This is going to be in the first part of the energy code, but it's applicable to mandatory measures. So if you're doing additions, alterations, and maybe you're looking for a trade-off, you might end up doing a high efficiency heat pump water heater, for example, to trade off something else. And so under 2025 code, these mandatory measures are going to apply. And one of the measures is pretty straightforward, and it's like you require a backup heat source. So that could be just the electric elements that are already in the tank. Then there's going to be ventilation requirements, and that is going to include how much volume of space is available for the heat pump compressor that sits on top of the tank. And then there's going to be requirements for a ducted system, and if they have permanent openings, but also if you don't have a ducted system, there's requirements for the net free area in, say, a louvered door. So you can look at the closets, maybe not going to meet the volume of space you need, but that closet can communicate to the rest of the, say, kitchen, laundry, living area, and you would calculate the net free area of that door and meet the requirements of either a formula based on compressor capacity or the manufacturer specifications, whichever's greater. And in many instances where I've looked at that, the manufacturer's requirement has been greater. And so that, I would say, just go with that most of the time. And these duct requirements are going to have a size opening and R6 ducts and sealed at the penetrations. Okay, so that's one set of mandatory measures. Then we come back to the residential part of the code, just that big bucket. And then there's mandatory measures for insulation of the pipes, the tanks. And just to be clear, that for additions and alterations, if the existing piping is not accessible, you don't have to insulate that. But everything that you can access, you're supposed to insulate it. And you're supposed to follow now the California Plumbing Code. So currently it's section 609.11. But that, under the updated California Plumbing Code, it's going to be 609.12. So just for those of you who are going back and forth through the code, and let's say you use up codes or ICC, codes online, just be clear that depending on which version of the plumbing code you grabbed, you're either going with the section 11 or the section 12. But either way, it's really specifically about pipe insulation thickness and what's required for that insulation. And under the new code, it's going to be referencing, 12. And kind of that main takeaway is that the thickness of the insulation needs to be as thick as the pipe diameter. And that's for the residential part of the code. They don't explicitly give you an R value anymore. They just do it by thickness. And, the thicker, more dense, the better. The pool noodle stuff, a lot of times it's not even the right thickness, but I do see it at the hardware stores a lot and see it on the job sites. Not quite what you're supposed to do. So that's a room for improvement. And our HERS rater will call folks out on it if it's not, or they should, if it's not insulated properly. Okay, this is a building department counter card available through the California Energy Commission. I'd put this in here because I think it is a nice table that just gives an idea very quickly what's required if you're altering the water heater, and that's what you're doing. That is the scope of work, is you're getting a new water heater. This gives you that information and lets you know if, for example, it'll ask you, is existing water heater electric resistance? If the answer is yes, you can go back to an electric resistance, or you can upgrade it to a heat pump. If the answer is no, then if it's natural gas or propane, you can do tank or tankless. You can go to a heat pump. You have options, but you can't go to an electric resistance if you don't already have an electric resistance. And then prescriptive alterations, water heater replacement. This is how it's written in the code, and this is referenced on the back of that card, and it addresses the pipe insulation shall be met, which we just talked about. It hits on distribution systems. If you've got going to do a recirc, needs to be demand recirculation. And then it goes through the options of your water heating types: natural gas, propane, heat pump water heaters, etc. And this section is not changed under the 2025 code. It remains the same. So that makes your water heater replacement projects really straightforward. And then for the electrification, electric ready, this is a question that comes up for us on additions, remodels, alterations. Really, there's only one kind of electric ready trigger, and that's if you're putting in a water heater in the addition that is natural gas or propane. Then that does trigger the electric ready for a heat pump water heater in the future, when that's a second water heater that you're putting in. And the new code will say an additional water heater that you're putting in. For the alterations, it's really a kind of electric ready. It's only triggered when the project increases the electric load beyond the existing panel capacity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we deal with the ADUs, because that often happens. Or if you're just upgrading your whole house with photovoltaic battery, you're going to be getting a new electric panel anyway, and you're going to have to follow the electric code. So otherwise, only new construction requires solar ready, battery ready, or the new 225 amp bus bar electric panel. And only that new construction is going to trigger electric ready on your cooktop, clothes dryer, space heating. So for the heat pump water heater, if you are installing a gas or propane water heater, so you're installing gas, then you need to make it heat pump water heater ready. And that means you're going to have a certain requirement if your designated space for that future heat pump water heater is within 3 feet or beyond 3 feet from your gas or propane on-demand water heater. But you need to dedicate a 30-inch by 30-inch by 7-foot tall space where that new appliance can fit. And then there's going to be some kind of requirements on what you do with your electric receptacle that's installed, and it just needs to be 125 volt, 20 amp receptacle. There's a minor change in the new code language for 2025. And instead of explicitly saying you need a 3-volt conductor, 10 gauge copper branch, it just says you just need a 30 amp branch circuit near there. So they simplified that, which is good. And part of this, part of these requirements also is that you label the space for your future 240 volt water heater use, and that you have that 30 amp dedicated branch circuit available within the required space. So that's really it. However, there are some mandatory measures to keep in mind that you're going to want to accommodate, because when that future heat pump water heater goes in, there needs to be a way to deal with your condensate line. And a lot of times it's easier, you know, during this whole remodel to just address that. In my case, like I'm constantly doing stuff to my own house. So the heat pump water heater is like my last puzzle piece in my electrification of my home. And so I like to experiment on myself before I tell you all about it. And so in my case, I'm like, okay, I found that space. I'm going to demo an existing closet and make a new closet for it. But I could take that condensate line and put it right into this area where we're draining for my washing machine. And so that's a legitimate way to do it. But you need to kind of think it through. And then there's a greater alignment with the electric code and the energy code for those requirements when you're doing the electrification, whether it's remodel or the new construction. You need to still have all your electrical work comply with Article 220 and size your loads and make sure that your electric panel meets those loads. And now, last section here, real quick. And I mean, it's fairly straightforward, but it's the HERS verifications, and that's the opportunities for credit. So we kind of went through some of the really big picture sort of requirements and maybe where folks would want to engage a HERS rater for going the performance method. And that's if they're going to have maybe more window than what prescriptively would be allowed, or perhaps they don't want to do continuous exterior insulation, or for some reason they don't want to increase their attic insulation, although that's usually one of the trade-offs that does help for the mitigating wall insulation and bigger windows. So you can engage your HERS rater to come out and take a look at existing conditions, but also they could do some other testing that could help you with the performance method and trade-offs. But under the 2025 code, the HERS rater gets a new name, ECC. And under our current code, we say HERS. All the HERS requirements and what HERS have to do is actually under Title 20 of the Energy Code. Under Title 20 of our whole code system. And Title 20 is the one that also deals with like efficiency of appliances, but that's where HERS falls. And it stands for Home Energy Rating System. And we talk about HERS, Field Verification Diagnostic Testing. But the new program under 2025 is going to refer to it as the ECC program. It's for Energy Code Compliance Program, and you'll have an Energy Code Compliance Rater, and they'll do field verification and diagnostic testing. So they kind of dropped off the word HERS. And a lot of times in the code, you'll see the acronym F, V, and DT. And then there's some new requirements specific to the ECC rater, where they're now going to be required to go through an quality assurance review, and they can do well on that and well enough to get exemplary status. So that's all part of the new system. So currently this is an excerpt from Energy Pro to give you an idea of the types of HERS measures available. So you can include quality insulation installation for a credit and additions over 700 square feet. It's a prescriptive requirement for those over 700 square feet, but if it's smaller, you could get some credit, or you could do envelope leakage testing. Sometimes that's hard though on existing structures to do the whole structure to meet this new credit, but it is available. The kitchen hood, that is triggered. I think it comes back to that question on the kitchen remodel that we had. This is the first thing came to mind, is that they're gonna, trigger the exhaust ventilation on that if you say it's a kitchen remodel. And then there's the HERS verified existing conditions being altered. And so depending on which systems are being altered, the HERS rater will come out and look at those. And these are the items that could be used for trade-offs, for credit if you need it under that performance method. And then additionally, there's the hot water distribution, all pipes insulated, we talked about. And then a new credit that's specific to heat pumps, variable capacity heat pump credit. We're seeing that being very useful. So if the extent of the remodel, and we've worked with a couple of builders who are, the remodel is everything on the inside is basically being torn out and they're starting over, then there's opportunities for doing a quality job of air sealing and better insulation. And so then it makes sense to look at QII as a potential measure for getting credit for other things. If you're installing mini split as part of the system, and it is either wall mounted or a ductless, like ceiling recessed system, there is a variable capacity heat pump credit you could take. And that in those cases, with the QII and this credit, you might be looking at that whole house and doing it basically as new construction and getting credit for it, or existing plus addition plus alteration. And that's what this looks like with the ceiling recessed. And the trick here is making sure that that unit is within a taped and sealed drywall air barrier boundary, or in the case of using like closed cell spray foam up at the roof deck, that would also count as an air barrier. So the water heating system is another place where we're seeing a benefit for getting credit. So your client may not have considered replacing their water heater, but if the water heater is old and they can replace it, and we can get a credit by moving to a heat pump water heater, for example, or something much higher efficiency, it can help offset some of those windows and that wall insulation. And if you're doing an addition and it's just a second water heater, it's not going to really give you a credit, but you definitely won't be penalized if you follow those prescriptive additions water heaters. And then insulation for piping. This is an example of what well-insulated heat pump water heating system looks like. And just a reminder that the plumbing code, it's been updated. It's going to reference 609.12, but if you pull up, an old version of the plumbing code, it'll be under part 11. So the existing conditions, so kind of in summary, the HERS rater will verify the status of that home's existing conditions through visual inspection. And then you're going to register through the HERS registry, and they're going to share that with the person doing your Title 24 and with the designer. And now the design team can make informed decisions for a trade-off. And if you don't do it this way, then you're going to have to use some default values, and you might not get where you need to go with your particular remodel. So the bottom line is hire your HERS rater during the design stage so that all this can be assessed. And then kind of last but not least is I recommend that you show that HERS, but in the future it's going to be ECC. Show the special features and field verification inspections on the cover sheet of your project so that the builder can see that up front, and anyone who's bidding on it, so that they would know, for example, that this project requires ECC rater field verification, like all pipes insulated, and existing conditions verification required. And if you have any more questions, Code Coach.
I want to chime in with the question we had from earlier that ties into just the end of that HERS discussion. Zach was wondering if we only get benefits from the verified existing conditions if the conditions are worse than the default values. So is there any value to doing the verified existing conditions if the existing conditions are the same or better than the default values? So my response was only if the conditions are worse, right? Assuming that the existing conditions are the same as the prescriptive values, then you would have a 0 credit, 0 penalty situation.
Right.
Is there anything more to add on how that relationship, when you know what your existing conditions are, what kind of credit you can expect in certain situations and not, or how that's altering your baseline?
Yeah, for example, like say there's an existing R19 in the ceiling, and you're in like climate zone 5. So an existing R19 doesn't trigger in climate zone 5 that you really have to do anything. I mean, and then you could, your baseline for that age of house probably is an R9. You're supposed to accurately say what the age of the house is, so that impacts it. Right. So you can't claim that it's like a house built in the 1920s when it was built in the 90s or 2000 has the R19. So you're supposed to accurately do that. And then you can take that R19 and go, well, hey, one of the things we could do for climate zone 5, and we have enough room, is let's push it up to an R38. So that could give you some credit, so it's worth mentioning it. But if your design team decides, you don't want to do it, then you don't have to click existing attic insulation as being one of the verified measures. So you get to pick and choose what's going to help you, but the idea is you pick something that's not great so that you can improve it to get the credit. Yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense. And so a lot of times we'll see like, they just can't really, like, it's not worth putting a lot of exterior rigid insulation on a flat roof, for example, but they could easily change their water heater. And that's why I mentioned that water heater thing over and over, because that just seems to be one that's showing up. Yeah.
Perfect. Zach, chime in if you had other follow-up on that. Otherwise, feel free to take it away to the end of this.
Okay, Danica, it's all you.
Next slide, please. So if you have any questions in receiving your continuing education units, please reach out to me via email. We will be sending out a survey in the next couple of days along with the recording and slides. We encourage you to fill the survey out to give us a better direction on what y'all are interested in. As Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the course, we have been doing a 5-part energy code implementation series, so 2025 code updates. We went over single family additions and alterations today, and we have 2 courses remaining focusing on ADUs and multifamily. And if you missed the first 2 courses, do not worry, we have the recordings of those courses in our on-demand page. We also have other upcoming courses with Inbound Screen Consulting, such as a builder's perspective on zero net energy on May 20th, and 2 others that are in person in Santa Barbara, a green building construction tour, and next generation passive solar. You can sign up for these trainings and see more offered on our website, 3c-ren.org. And with that, I'm passing it back to you, Jennifer and Grant, for any remaining questions. I'll also send the link to the on-demand page on the chat.
Okay, thanks everyone. I understand lots of folks probably need to jump off. They have other stuff to do, but we're happy to stay on the line for a couple more minutes as time allows. If there's any like burning questions or something someone wants to ask, or if there was something in the chat we missed.
I don't think we missed any in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we may be good. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Have a great day. Goodbye.